Welcome to Biomechanics on Our Minds. My name is Melissa Boswell.
And I'm Hannah O'Day, and we're PhD students at Stanford University.
This podcast is brought to you by the International Society of Biomechanics.
It's
time for Boom.
Welcome to Boom, where we have
Biomechanics on our minds.
Boom.
Boom.
Boom, boom, boom.
Boom, 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 boom.
Boom.
Welcome to the second episode of Student Voices, which is a series of Biomechanics on Our Minds. My name is Melissa Boswell.
And I'm Hannah O'Day.
And we're students at Stanford. Today we're talking with Ricky Pimentel, who is a PhD student in biomedical engineering at UNC Chapel Hill and NC State, and Roger Paxton, who is a research project manager for general neurology at Children's Hospital Colorado. And Ricky and Roger, you two did your own interview talking about open access. And so we're really excited to hear about that. But first, we just wanted to chat with you before we dive into your interview. So thank you for talking with us.
Yeah, glad to be here.
Yeah.
Thanks
so
for
what got
having
you
us.
interested? And in your interview, you focused on open access issues. So what got you interested in talking about that?
Yeah, so I think open access is an area that's kind of gotten a lot of press lately. And I think we've all had the situation where we try and read a research article. And even if you're on a campus with a pretty big library that has access to a lot of journals, there's still paywalls that we can't get through, and we can't read the article. And so I've been really fortunate to be at large universities as a student that has access to lots of journals. But I mean, you always seem to find one way or another that you don't have access to. So it's just kind of frustrating. And then you can really start to empathize with people that don't have institutional access or on research articles or research journals that want to learn more about it or want to study a certain area, especially students and scientists in other countries. And then just people that want to learn more about research in general. It's, the articles may or may not be useful to them, but a lot of times, you just want to see what's out there. And so I just thought it was an area that had a lot of impact and potential. And yeah, I was just learning a lot by diving into what is out there and what's been done on open access.
So I completely echo those sentiments. For me, I guess there are three areas in which I'm very much interested with regard to open access. So first of all, maximizing the impact of research in an ongoing way, and maximizing dissemination secondary to that. Second of all, best addressing my own research needs, perhaps very selfishly, but trying to put together the best research that I possibly can. And to that end, the more resources that I have, the better off I'm likely to be. And third, making as much of science available to the lay public as possible.
Yeah, and we appreciate you guys really diving deep into this and reaching out to people that are also interested in this topic and conducting the interview. Do you have any advice for other students that might want to do a Student Voices episode? Like, how was it for you, and would you recommend any tips?
Yeah, I kind of got into this just because I was at a conference. I was at ISB, and I saw Melissa and Hannah talking, and I was like, oh my gosh, like I've listened to all their episodes. Like I want to talk with them and just like introduce myself. And of course, they're like, yeah, we're going to do this Student Voices thing. You should totally, jump on board with it. And so we started like emailing a little bit after the conference. And they said it's really easy to get people on. And I agree with that because it kind of, like they said, it kind of gives you an excuse to just reach out to whoever. And we were able to interview probably the pioneer of open access, the guy that's been with it from day zero, Dr. Peter Suber. So it was just an incredible opportunity. I learned a lot, and I feel like I made some good connections and also got to rope Roger into this as well, one of my good friends.
Yeah, and I guess a bit of insight that I might give is don't let titles or anything like that hold you back for the people who you might want to interview. So there's a lot of great research going on at smaller institutions. At the same time, folks who are regarded as very, very big figures in their field, they would be more than happy typically to talk about the research that they have going on and their interests as well.
We really appreciate it. And we found similar things, but I think it means a lot coming from another student who hasn't been involved in the podcast. Yeah, other people that haven't been involved in the podcast. And to kind of like set the precedence for other students that are interested in conducting an interview or have a topic that they think is interesting and want to talk about it on the podcast. Because also you had this amazing interview with someone that you're saying is like, one of the founders of this open access concept. And it's really amazing to be able to share that conversation with other people, which is kind of like a open access in itself.
Yeah, you're talking about maximizing dissemination. Boom is like the ultimate dissemination tool, right? So.
Yeah, well, thank you. I'm really excited to listen to the interview and learn from your conversations.
Thank you, Hannah and Melissa, for providing this opportunity to students in biomechanics. This is great, and it's really fun, and I think everyone's learning a lot.
Yeah, our pleasure.
All right, without further ado, let's get on to the interview.
Who do I hear? Voices. Student is near. Voices. Student voices. Voices.
We're live. Welcome, Boom listeners. My name is Ricky Pimentel. I am a PhD student at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and at North Carolina State University. This is an episode of Student Voices, where students in biomechanics are recording on behalf of the Boom team to share our experiences and our interests with the biomechanics field. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with two guests. So I'll let you both introduce yourself right now.
My name is Roger Paxton. I am Research Project Manager for General Neurology at Children's Hospital, Colorado.
Hi, I'm Peter Suber. I'm the Director of the Office for Scholarly Communication at Harvard.
Awesome. Thank you, Roger and Peter, for joining us today. And we're going to be talking about open access. And we have what I believe is the pioneer of the open access movement, if I'm not mistaken, in Dr. Peter Suber. Is this title correct, Dr. Suber?
I wouldn't use that title for myself, but I've been in it for a long time, and I was one of the early voices that helped spread the word.
So can you talk with us about how you got involved with open access?
Sure. I was a professor of philosophy starting in the early 80s, and I was a publishing philosopher at the time the internet and web came along. And I was also kind of geeky, so I put my publications on the web as soon as I could, primarily to play with HTML and see how that worked. But then I noticed unexpectedly that the online versions of my articles got more scholarly attention, stimulated more serious feedback from scholars in my field than the print versions of the same publications. And some of those print publications had been 10 years old and had barely elicited any serious correspondence. But the online versions, which were also free, of course, they were free online, stimulated serious correspondence almost from the moment they went online. So what started out as a kind of geeky exploration of this very cool new thing turned into a realization that the web was a medium for serious scholarship. And I began to look around to see which other scholars had noticed that and were doing something about it. I hoped others were doing something so that I could just follow along. I had a full-time job, and I wanted to do that job and just pay attention on the side to this fascinating new development. But very, very few people were paying attention to that or doing anything about it. So I began to dig and publicize what I was finding. The very few scholarly projects that were putting their work online and making them free. And I began to analyze them and publicize them, as I say, broadcast them, spread the word about them, and encourage others to do the same. And even though I wished somebody else had done that so I could have read their work, I ended up turning into the expert that I had been waiting for. And after a couple of years, I launched a newsletter devoted to open access. At the time, that term hadn't been coined, so I called it Free Online Scholarship. And I published it until the Budapest Open Access Initiative came along. I was at the table for that, and we coined the term open access, and I changed the title of my newsletter to the Open Access Newsletter and began calling it Open Access ever since. And as you can tell, the term has spread.
That's great, and really interesting how you almost catalyzed a movement there, Peter. How long did it take for publishers to sort of catch on to your game, and how did they respond to that?
Publishers noticed fairly early, and I think because we were very small and the proponents were few in number, they were not alarmed. Obviously, they didn't support this. They were not going to switch to open access on their own. But it quickly got bigger. That is, more and more scholars saw the point and began advocating it and making their own work open. And eventually it became big enough to be threatening. And I would say the almost universal reaction of publishers, very, very small number of exceptions, was that this was harmful. And of course, their objections were exaggerated. And I want to say this in the most compassionate way. They had a financial interest in stopping open access, but they also had, let's call it a beginner's misunderstanding about open access. There's a period when some very new thing is simply misunderstood because it's very new. Even if the same critics eventually turn into cynical misunderstanders and misrepresenters of the movement, at the beginning, I can't really blame them for misunderstanding because it was a new thing. And so a lot of their objections were based on ignorance and misunderstanding. And in that sense, they were easy to answer. And when they saw that their objections were based on false assumptions, I think they felt a little beleaguered and certainly defensive. And so I kept expecting them to raise more sophisticated objections based on evidence. That almost never happened. However, they did organize, and I think they had a hard time strategizing about how to push back against this. It was a kind of threat they had not faced before. This was a popular movement. It wasn't, let's say, a business rival or a competitor. And the people in the movement were their own authors and their own readers, and they couldn't push back too hard against them. And eventually, some publishers, a small number of publishers, began adopting open access themselves and endorsing it. These tended to be smaller nonprofit publishers. The large for-profit publishers have profit margins that exceed those of the oil industry or the healthcare industry. I mean, they are obscene. They're in the 35 to 40% range, and they were not going to change. And they had a kind of monopoly grip on academic publishing. But there was no, let's say, monolithic publishing industry. More and more of the publishers outside the large group began to sympathize with open access, support it, and criticize the, let's call it the ill-informed objections of the large publishers. And so it turned into a debate. And that's roughly where we are today, except there's been more progress. There's more open access. There are more people supporting it. More publishers have adapted, even if they don't fully adopt it. Many, I would say essentially all the large publishers now publish at least some kinds of open access for some of their work. And that's a kind of concession that we would not have predicted in the early days.
That's really interesting. I really appreciate how you have kind of the whole story from start to finish. That's not very common. So thank you for all your hard work for the past decades in this area. Before we get into what's going on today and more recent things in open access, I wanted to ask a question about planning out working in open access. I believe you told us before that you quit your day job at the time, back around 2000 or the late 90s, to go upon this open access journey. And first of all, that's pretty big. So I was wondering about that. But then also a second follow-up question was, what was your goal or plan or roadmap, or how did you confront this issue moving forward?
It's a good question. As I say, I was a tenured professor at the time I discovered this, and I was very excited by it. I was throwing my time into it almost against my will because I wished someone else were throwing their time into it and I could just follow what they were doing. But about the time I was becoming excited, I also had a sabbatical. And at my college, you could take a full year at half salary or half year at full salary. And I took the full year at half salary. So I was living frugally, but I had the whole year to spend. And I was planning to finish a few philosophy articles that I had started. But I had just become infatuated with open access. And I just pushed those articles off my desk and threw myself into open access. And as I say, nobody was really tracking it. So I took that on as my job. I wanted to unearth all the little projects that were not well publicized and see them as working toward a common cause, actually see them as part of a movement. In fact, I made the conscious decision to call it a movement, even though it wasn't yet a movement, because I thought that would make it into a movement. And I think something like that actually happened. But basically, I spent an entire sabbatical year on open access all day, every day. And I realized it was terribly exciting. I did not lose my interest toward the end of the year. It wasn't getting tired or old for me. And when I got back to my college at the end of the year, I was obliged to give it another year because it's an investment in your work, and they don't want you to go on sabbatical and then quit. But I decided I really did have to quit and throw myself into this full time. So I spent that year back at the college tidying up and arranging to leave. And I didn't know how I would support myself. I didn't know how to get a salary. But I forgot to mention, I did receive a grant during that sabbatical year. In the middle of the year, I realized I'm on half salary. I really could use some subsidy for the other half of my salary. So I wrote to a foundation that might have supported open access. I described what I was doing, and I said, could you give me a grant to replace the missing half of my salary? And they said, we know what you're doing. How much do you want? Very, very gratifying. So I quit my job without having another job and without knowing whether there were any jobs in this. I just knew I wanted to work on it full time, and I couldn't do that, honestly, while being a full-time philosophy professor. But I got this grant pretty readily, and I thought, well, I can get grants for a couple more years. But again, I was not thinking about the long term. I wasn't thinking about 10 or 20 years. But I ended up living on grants and nothing but grants for about a decade. Then I got a fellowship at Harvard, which turned into a salaried position. So I've come back in from the cold.
That's really brave, Peter. I mean, having been in that same situation, having left a job when I didn't have another one lined up, that can be intimidating, to say the least. So from what I'm hearing, it sounds like perhaps your home institution at the time maybe didn't have a full appreciation of your work and your investment in it, but it sounds like outside parties did have a better appreciation of that if you were so well supported by grant monies. Is that the case?
No, I wouldn't put it that way. In fact, the president of my college at the time was very sympathetic. It's just that I wanted to work on this full time, and I was hired to do something else full time.
That's great. That's quite the story. All right. So just around the start of this year, there was a lot of news and press on the University of California. And they were mulling over their decision on whether or not to withdraw from Elsevier journals. And this was hotly debated on many websites, many fronts. And then I think about halfway through the year, they decided to withdraw their subscription. And I was just wondering, Peter, what your thoughts were on their decision and how that may impact open access and scholarly publishing overall.
Yeah. First, I applaud their decision. The background here is that academic publishers have a kind of captive audience. If they raise prices, university libraries cannot go anywhere else to get the same commodities. And every academic journal is a mini monopoly. The articles in that journal are not published anywhere else. So if you want those articles, you have to buy access to that journal. And in that sense, publishers can jack up prices way beyond their production costs. That is, they can extract huge profit margins, and they can take advantage of their monopoly position. And they have been doing that for a long time. Journal prices began exceeding inflation back in the 1970s. So in the 80s and the 90s, libraries were already calling it a crisis. And we not only was it causing damage, but it was at the crisis level. And libraries couldn't realistically cancel these journals because their mission depended on access to these journals. Students and faculty needed access to these journals. So they cut other things. In order to pay for journals, they began buying fewer books. And this caused a crisis in all the disciplines. Most sciences depend critically on journals, or they depend on journals more than the humanities. But humanities depend on books. And because the high price of journals caused libraries to buy fewer books, the crisis shifted to the humanities as well. They had fewer books. It was harder for humanities authors to get their books published because book publishers were publishing fewer as libraries began to buy fewer. And so publishers had basically turned their own customers against them as early as the 80s and the 90s. And there was this crisis atmosphere in libraries. And every now and then a library would threaten to cancel, especially to cancel on a large scale. But they almost never did it because, again, they were pinched. They had this mission to provide access to their students and faculty. But long before California, other libraries did begin to cancel, and canceled on a large scale. California was not the first to do that. What's interesting about California, though, is that it's so big. It's a 10-campus system. It's one of the largest universities in the world. It's certainly the largest in the United States. And I'm going to get this number wrong, but I think roughly 4% of Elsevier articles are written by faculty at the University of California. And they took a hard line. Not only did they want lower prices, but they wanted more open access. And I can talk about how they wanted Elsevier to deliver that, but that's a little bit beside the point right now. But they took a hard line, and they had a lot of bargaining power. A small institution does not have a lot of bargaining power against Elsevier, which is a huge publisher. And Elsevier would not meet their terms. And then California just called their bluff, or fulfilled its own vow and canceled. And when this happens, when it has happened in the past, every librarian used to predict faculty rebellion because, of course, they lost access to these journals. But in an increasing number of cases, libraries did cancel on a large scale, and there was no faculty rebellion. And this is roughly what happened in California. There were a few California faculty who were complaining about this, but it appears that the majority are not complaining. And at the time California did cancel, they got a letter of endorsement for their decision from the faculty senate. So first of all, it was very smart for them to work with the faculty before canceling, so they were not taking the faculty by surprise. They persuaded the faculty of the crisis and of the serious steps necessary to address the crisis. They persuaded the faculty senate, and they got this letter of endorsement the very same day they announced the cancellation itself. And then after the cancellation, several other major libraries in the United States issued public statements of support. They didn't have to do that. I'm sure there were a lot of private statements of support, but if you're going to give a public statement of support, then you're almost tipping your hand and telling the public you're about to do the same thing yourself.
Yeah, that's incredible. I've seen some of the support, but I didn't know that there were like public letters of support from other libraries around the country and world.
From your perspective, Peter, with the faculty support of this, the very wise approach with the University of California, I think, how do other services like preprint services and things along those lines play into this, where even though there might not be formal open access from a given journal, there are avenues to getting similar, if not the same information for faculty members?
Mm-hmm. Most preprint servers are open access. And just for the people in the audience who don't know, a preprint is an article, a journal article, but it has not yet undergone peer review. That's why it's pre, as in preprint. And one that has undergone peer review is usually called a postprint. And the early stages of the open access movement were about providing open access to postprints because the peer-reviewed version was considered the most valuable, and probably still is. But open access to preprints was an overlooked opportunity for most disciplines in the early days. There are exceptions. In physics and mathematics, there was a flourishing open access preprint exchange, still is, which is kind of a model for other disciplines to emulate. It took the other disciplines a long time to figure that out and to follow suit. But when you share a preprint openly, there's no publisher to stand in the way. There's no publisher to object. There's no publisher copyright to infringe or risk infringing. So first of all, there are no barriers to doing it, or fewer barriers. And then there are certain benefits. If you share your preprint, then you put a public timestamp on your work, and you can claim priority for any important discovery that you made. And this concerns academic authors. They don't want to be scooped. They might suspect that other people are working on the same problem at the same time, but they would like to be the ones who publish first. The sooner you can put your work out in the public eye and give it an authoritative timestamp, the more you can prove your priority over others working on the same problem. Plus, you can alert people working in your general area that somebody's addressing this problem and they're approaching it in a certain way. That can encourage collaboration. It can also encourage feedback that helps you improve the article when you later submit it to publication. Those are all to the good. And publishers had almost no defense against this except what we call the Engelfinger rule, named after a journal editor named Hans Engelfinger at the New England Journal of Medicine. And the Engelfinger rule simply said, we will not consider an article for publication if it has already circulated in essentially any form. Even if the author gave a press conference about their important findings, that's enough for us to exclude it from consideration. And the Engelfinger rule started in the field of medicine on the theory, or at least the public theory, that unpeer-reviewed medical research was dangerous. But it was quickly adopted outside the field of medicine, basically because it helped secure publisher monopolies. It helped prevent the growth of preprints, preprint exchanges, preprint open access. On the other hand, today, the Engelfinger rule is in decline. It has not disappeared. And before authors do share their preprints, I want to let them know you should pay attention to whether the journals you care about still follow the Engelfinger rule. If they do, you could be harming yourself by sharing your preprint. But if they don't, then you can only benefit yourself. I think apart from the Engelfinger rule, sharing preprints is all to the good. It helps authors, it helps readers, and journals who don't use the Engelfinger rule don't mind.
Yeah, and I've had a lot of collaborators or coworkers that had questions about this Engelfinger rule. And my first question on that was about the copyright. So when you publish a preprint, you have your own copyright for the authors. And then if it gets accepted by a journal, my understanding is that the authors still hold this copyright, but it needs to be of a certain type so that the publishers may...
At least the first part is right. When you write something, and if you have not published it yet, that is, if you've not signed any contract with a publisher, then the entire copyright belongs to you. And the permission to make it open access through a preprint repository comes entirely from you. It's your call. You don't need to clear it with anybody else. When you do go to publish, you sign a publishing contract, and the contract transfers certain rights to the publisher. And it's hard to generalize about this because every publisher has a different contract, but that's when some rights are transferred to the publisher. The most traditional publishing contract gave publishers essentially all rights. But modern contracts give publishers key rights, essential rights, without necessarily giving them all rights. But some publishers' contracts let the author share the postprint in an open access repository, and some don't. The majority of them do, by the way, which is one of the early victories of the open access movement. But once you sign a publishing contract, you're no longer the sole owner of the entire copyright. You've given key rights to the publisher.
Okay. And these can be negotiated as a case-by-case basis, correct?
Well, within limits, or let's say with difficulty, because one author against a large publisher has almost no bargaining power. The author can always ask for a revision in the contract, and I encourage authors to try. I do think there's no harm in asking. I've never heard of a paper rejected just because the author asked for a different contract. But the answer is usually no, and then the author has a hard decision to make.
I've had conversations with co-authors about submitting preprints. Usually they're hesitant because of the Inglefinger rule to submit to a preprint repository. I was wondering if you had any advice or tips on how to navigate these discussions and to encourage open access.
That's a really hard question because some journals really do follow the Inglefinger rule. And if you know which ones they are, and if you really have your heart set on publishing in one of those journals, then you should probably not share your preprint, or you should rethink your intention to publish in one of those journals. Another part of the difficulty here is that it's actually hard to tell which journals follow the Inglefinger rule. If they do, they tend not to call it the Inglefinger rule, so you can't just search for the word Inglefinger. And nobody wants to read all the legalese on a publisher's website, especially multiplied by 20, if you're going to compare 20 journals to see which ones might be friendly to preprint sharing. So if you suspect that some but not all the journals that you care about follow the Inglefinger rule, it's very hard to tell which ones exactly do. This is one place where communal knowledge or some sort of crowdsourced cataloging of journals could help out. I think if authors had really good knowledge in advance, if they saw the benefits of preprint sharing, then they could share their preprints and plan to publish in the journals that were fine with that.
That's interesting. Are there any efforts at this point for some sort of, I don't know, mindshare or clearinghouse regarding authors' experiences with these sorts of journals?
Well, actually, there were efforts like this starting a long time ago, but they mostly fizzled, and I haven't seen other efforts take their place. But there were attempts to create wikis, analogous to Wikipedia, in which every journal had a page, and the page was open to edits by the public, and people could just insert anecdotes about their experience getting their work peer-reviewed there. Was it rigorous or not rigorous? Was the delay long or short? Were the people rude or polite? It was kind of like Yelp for academic journals. And I always thought that was a great idea, and I never understood why they never caught on. But after one of them died, another one started up, and then that one died, and another one started up. So a lot of people thought it was a good idea, but not enough to actually keep them going. And I don't know of anything like that today. There are catalogs of journals, and some of them are built for the, say, the authors who care about open access. But I don't know any that include the tag on whether a journal does or does not follow the Inglefinger rule.
I've seen a website, and I actually just checked it right now, called Sherpa or Romeo.
Yeah, that's not a journal, it's a database. And it's one of these databases that's designed to help the author who wants open access. If you want to know basically what the publishing contract will let you do and not let you do, without actually reading the contract, Sherpa will summarize it for you.
Yeah, so I've used this in the past to see which journals have open access rules and what types of rules. And I think you're right. It looks like all of this is a wiki, so anyone can add to it. And there are areas that are still unknown for many journals, but it seems to be fairly correct.
It's very well done. It's not quite crowdsourced, but they welcome corrections and updates from the crowd. They base their summaries on the actual contracts when they can get their hands on them, and when they can link to a public version of the contract, they do that. But very often publishers will modify their contracts, and they don't do it to undermine Sherpa. They just do it for their own business reasons. And Sherpa isn't always up to date with that. But when they're not up to date, readers, users can tell Sherpa, this provision has been changed, or there's a new version of the contract you ought to notice. So thanks to this crowdsourcing, Sherpa is quite comprehensive and up to date. But if you really want the last word on a given publisher's contract, you really have to go to that publisher and read the contract.
Okay. Roger, I'll let
too.
you ask a question since I've been doing a lot of the asking, so go for it.
Yeah, so mine is pretty global, I guess. What do you see as our current greatest barriers moving forward, and how do you see open access moving forward in, say, the next 10 years, Peter?
The biggest single barrier today is probably the promotion and tenure committees. Promotion and tenure committees might even be staffed by faculty who support open access, but they're not thinking about access and its openness when they set their criteria for promotion and tenure. They think about the quality of research, which is fine. They ought to. That ought to be their top priority. But when they think about quality of research, they tend to use metrics for quality, which have the perverse effect of discriminating against open access journals. And I say perverse because it's not as if open access journals were lower in quality. When these promotion and tenure committees give points, let's say, or give greater weight to articles published in certain high prestige, venerable journals, those tend to be journals that are not open access because they've been around for 50 years or even 100 years. And in that sense, they're giving weight to non-open journals, even when open journals in the same field might be publishing work of the same quality. So they're not discriminating against open journals because they're open, and they're not discriminating against them because they're second-rate or lower in quality. They're simply discriminating in favor of the venerable, the old, the prestigious. And it's no accident that that tends to exclude the open journals because, on average, open journals are much newer. And it takes a while for even a high-quality open journal to develop a reputation or prestige proportional to its quality. And so these committees tend to go by prestige rather than quality, or they tend to use prestige as a surrogate for quality. And that tends to exclude newer journals, even when the new journals are subscription-based or non-open. If there's a brand new scientific discipline, like nanotechnology, the journals in that field are going to be new too, and they will tend to be excluded from these lists on the same grounds. They're new. They don't have the prestige of the old ones. And so it's a bottleneck, and it's a bottleneck that's hard to explode because it's very hard to control promotion and tenure committee practices from the outside. Faculty on these committees, I think rightly, cherish their autonomy. They want to be the ones to decide what counts, what should get weight in their decisions. And deans and provosts and presidents know that, and so they don't want to touch this with a 10-foot pole. And so you've got department-level decision-making going on that tends to favor the non-open journals for reasons utterly unrelated to openness. And I wish we could solve that problem, but unfortunately, it's a cultural problem, not a technical, legal, or economic problem. The open access movement has faced technical, legal, and economic problems, and we have good solutions to all of them. The cultural problems are harder because there's no easy solution to them except waiting them out. And in this case, I think waiting them out is the solution that will eventually work best. Generational change will fix this one. Eventually, the young generation that grew up as digital natives, that want their work to be open, that expect all important work to be open, will eventually sit on those committees, and they'll revise their practices as they go, as they arrive.
Yeah, that's a lot of factors at play. And one thing is that I'm noticing, at least, is a lot of journals are hybrid now. So there are open access and regular subscription versions or ways to submit.
Yes. And if we have time, I'm not a big fan of hybrid journals. In the early days, they looked like a promising way for a non-open journal to experiment with the economics of open, to see whether it could recover its expenses. But now I think it's generally an obstacle to open. These are subscription journals that make some of their articles open, but not all of them. And the ones that they do make open are the ones for which they can get a fee called an article processing charge. And there are several problems. One is that they tend to double dip. They charge a subscription that covers the costs of all the articles in the journal. And then they get this extra fee, the APC, for some of the articles in the journal. So they're getting more money than they used to. They're getting paid twice for the open access articles in the journal. Moreover, they're still charging a subscription. So they're still breaking the budgets of libraries. I said this was a crisis even in the 80s and the 90s, and it's much, much worse today. So hybrid journals don't fix that problem at all. And we won't be able to pay for high quality open access journals in every niche until we can free up the library money that's now being spent on subscription journals. And by the way, if we could, the money would be more than enough. So the problem is not finding new money. The problem is redirecting money now spent on closed or non-open journals and redirecting it to open. But hybrid journals don't allow us to redirect the money because they still charge subscriptions. And in my view, paying APCs at hybrid journals simply pays them to stay hybrid and therefore to perpetuate the problem. So here at Harvard, we have a fund to pay APCs for Harvard people who publish in the fee-based open access journals, but we do not spend the money on hybrid journals.
While we're on the topic of journal fees, Peter, you've written before in at least one spot, maybe multiple places, that these open access journal fees are composed of peer review fees, manuscript preparation fees, and server fees. And you've argued that all of these are worthy costs. We have to pay these fees to have articles available to all of us. But I was wondering about, do you think these open access fees, in those three categories, peer review, manuscript preparation, and server space, do you think those fees could be decreased by using already existing repository servers and maybe implementing some formatting guidelines or automation for manuscript preparation?
I definitely do. Different publishers have different operating costs, and all publishers, open and non-open, have good reasons to want to reduce their costs, provided they can do it without reducing their quality. And the fact that they still have widely different costs proves how hard it is to adopt cost-saving measures. But there are cost-saving measures, and open access journals are not getting subscription revenue, even if they have revenue from other sources. So they have, let's say, the strongest incentive to reduce costs. And there are lots of ways to do that. And as I say, the best open access journals in a given field, the best journals in a given field almost always include some open access journals. So the best open access journals are as good as the best non-open journals. Quality is not the real consideration here. And you can get journals at that level of quality with lower expenses by adopting some measures that traditional closed publishers could adopt if they were more motivated. One reason they're less motivated is that they tend to be larger and older, and they have legacy overhead from the age of print. And most open access publishers are lean and mean startups, so they don't have to pay the legacy overhead. And then some open access publishers, just to be frank, depend more on volunteerism than traditional publishers. But I don't want to fail to mention, even traditional monopolistic, extremely wealthy and profitable closed publishers depend on volunteerism as well. Authors are not paid for their articles. Peer reviewers are not paid to do peer review. The others in the back office who do the layout and the hosting and sometimes the copy correction are paid for sure. But open access journals have proved that you can do that at the same level of quality at lower prices. And you mentioned the network of repositories as a way of saving money. A growing number of journals are turning toward that. There are more than 4,000 open access repositories around the world. We have one at Harvard. Many universities have them. A growing number have them. They provide open access to their contents. They are generally well preserved. They are interoperable. They comply with certain common standards. And some new journals use them as their distribution channel. So instead of doing peer review and editing plus distribution, they simply do peer review and editing. And then when they're done, they deposit in one of these repositories and then take advantage of the already existing global network of open repositories. It's an infrastructure waiting to be used by journals. It's already used by authors, but not always used by journals themselves. Journals like that are called overlay journals because they're overlaid on top of these repositories. And it's a viable model. It's probably the least expensive way to publish a high-quality, peer-reviewed journal. But even today, only a fairly small number of journals are overlaid. But I think in the future, more and more of them will be, especially as the repository infrastructure itself improves.
Yeah, that's great to hear that this is already underway and hopefully starting to be more prevalent. All right, well, we're getting a little tight on time. Roger, I know you have to go soonish. Okay. So the only thing I was going to finish was research fails. So that's a common, or in every Boom episode, we like to share research fails so that we can kind of change the culture in failing in science, and be more accepting of failure and share our things that we've struggled with because we're all trying something new. So I was wondering if Roger, if you wanted to share a research fail, and then we'll go on to Peter.
Research fails. Yes, it does.
Certainly. So a research fail for me, I suppose, would be one study that I was involved in during my PhD program where we were simply, we believe, using the wrong measures. So utilizing relatively gross functional performance measures, we showed no significant differences between a sham and a control group, but we did show significant differences in quality of life scores and self-perceived functional performance scores by the research participants. So choose your right measures up front. That's my take on it.
So you didn't show any changes in the outcome, in the scientific outcome measures, but the participants thought that they had improved.
Indeed, and I mean, at the end of the day, they are the experts in terms of themselves. They know themselves best. So we did have significant results in self-perceived scores, but not in proper quantitative terms.
All right. And Peter, any notable research fails?
Yeah, it's a hard question. Not because I haven't committed any, but because I've so often had to make a retraction or to apologize for a factual error. I do less deep research into open access than I do advocacy based on research or advocacy based on facts as they are at a given time. And I've had advocacy failures. That is, I've advocated for what I later decide was the wrong conclusion. So I can give you one of those. The open access movement started before Creative Commons licenses came out. And there is a copyright problem with open access if you're not careful. That is, you could infringe copyright, or you could fail to give your users all the reuse rights that they ought to have in order to make their research flexible and possible. And when I was still putting my own articles online, before there was much of an open access movement, I had to decide what to do with copyright as well, and there was no Creative Commons license to lean on. So I handwrote an open license that said you can use this work for anything you want, provided you give me credit and provided you do not sell it for a profit. Today we would call that a CC by NC license. NC stands for non-commercial. And then when CC licenses came out, I endorsed them. I thought they were a terrific idea. By the way, I still do. But I leaned in favor of the NC license, the non-commercial license. And it took me about a year to realize I didn't have a good reason for that. I had a few colleagues who did not insist on NC. That is, they would let people use their work for any purpose, provided there was attribution, and they didn't care whether people sold it for a profit. And I began to wonder why I cared. And I realized it was a kind of, what's the best word, spite or resentment. If I'm not going to make profit from this, nobody else should make a profit from this. And yet, if somebody else did make a profit from this, that would not detract from the openness of the work. It would not detract from the attribution to me. I would still have the impact in the audience that I wanted. So I just dropped that and basically apologized for it. That was an advocacy mistake. And that was around 2001 or 2002, so that was pretty early. And since then, I've noticed other people who just get into this for the first time recommend the NC version of the open license. That is, they want to restrict commercialization. But I suspect they're like I was. I suspect they're doing it because they're not making any money from it. And if they're not, they don't want anybody else to. But the goal of an open license is to make your work widely available to others and to make sure you get credit and impact. And letting other people make commercial use of it is simply proof that your work is useful or in demand, but without taking anything away from your access, your impact, or your audience.
Because if someone was going to use your work to create something, if they could be paid for it, then your work could live on further because they would be sustainable.
That's right. And for example, my 2012 book on open access has been translated into several languages. Some of them are commercial. That is, the publisher in the other language wants to sell the work. And unfortunately, the book at the time was under an NC license. It's no longer, by the way, under an NC license. But that meant that publisher had to negotiate with my publisher for permission. And that slowed everything down. And the delay itself harmed the cause. And if it were up to me, I would have let them do it without any negotiation, even though they wanted to sell it. Let them do the translation, let them sell it. I don't care. It still helps me out for there to be a translation.
All right. Well, I'm afraid that's all we have time for today. Roger, I know you got to go, so I think we're just going to end it right here, if that's okay with you two.
That's great. Ricky, Peter, thanks so much for your time. I really enjoyed this.
Yeah. Thank you, Roger and Peter. This was a great discussion on open access, and hopefully can lead to many more discussions in the future.
Thanks to you both. I appreciate your questions.
Thanks for listening to Student Voices, a series by Biomechanics on Our Minds, by students and for students. If you have an idea for an episode of Student Voices, or if you want to host your own episode, please reach out to us at biomechanicsonourminds@gmail.com or tweet at us at biomechanicsoom.
We'd love to hear from you. Let's keep these conversations going.
Bida boom, Gucci. Bida boom, Louis. Bida boom. Bida boom.